Unjust by design, Canada's administrative justice system.
People talk about the justice system and they think of the Small Claims Court, the Ontario Provincial Court, the Ontario Superior Court, the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court of Canada, and that's the justice system. But the fact of the matter is that the largest majority of judicial decisions impacting the lives of Canadians and Canadian businesses are not in the courts, in that part of the justice system, but in the other part of the justice system, which we call the administrative justice system. And it is comprised of a whole series of adjudicative tribunals that are issuing judicial decisions. The seriousness of the matters that are under review by these tribunals is just as serious as the courts. And so this is the part of the justice system. And the problem is that there is no respect for the rule of law in the structures of that system. And that needs to be fixed. These are judicial functions that are being exercised. The rule of law, principle of judicial independence applies to them. That rule of law principle requires impartial and independent tribunals. None of these tribunals are either independent or impartial. They are not independent because the institutions themselves are under the close control of the government. Budget, appointments, reappointments, resources, administrative support. So you have tribunals being asked to decide cases in which the government has an interest, usually, sometimes direct, always indirect, and they are controlled by the government who has that interest. And so they can't be argued that they're independent, and nobody inside the system thinks they're independent. And then you have the appointment and reappointment problems, and the selection, because of course part of the problem is the influence that patronage and partisan political influences have on the selection process. So any adjudicator who is contemplating a decision that is likely to seriously embarrass the government or any of the government's friends knows that when they sign that decision, they are putting the renewal of their appointment in jeopardy and therefore their adjudicative career in jeopardy. So it is one of the basic tenets of rule of law, judicial independence requirement, is security of tenure. And so that goes out the window immediately under those circumstances. The problem was they started out with regulatory agencies. There's a difference between an adjudicative tribunal and a regulatory agency like the Energy Board or the CRTC, who are dealing with government policy and administering government policy and are not exercising judicial functions. But they then went to, when they got that kind of structured pattern in place, and then when they needed an adjudicative, a new policy, new rights, but instead of assigning the adjudication of those rights to the courts, they would assign it to a new tribunal. And so that's been the way it has been from the beginning. And why it hasn't ever been noticed is a good question. The law requires that a person exercising a judicial function both be and be seen to be impartial. Okay, and the be seen to be is a critical component of the concept. The problem is that now people who are appointed to these positions will typically be people of integrity, and faced with that kind of a situation, there's good hope that the individual will make the decision that the law and the evidence requires. But from the point of view of the party, or any person who knows about that situation, the question that the law asks is, the objective informed person have a reasonable apprehension of bias? And against that test, nobody in the Ontario or any Canadian administrative justice system satisfies that test, with the exception of the administrative tribunal in Quebec. What is needed is a Bill of Rights for administrative justice to begin with. And in that Bill of Rights, one would pronounce that nobody will exercise a judicial function that is not objectively, demonstrably impartial and independent. So you start with that Bill of Rights. And then you need a Council of Administrative Justice, a central governing council that is independent. And you give it a fixed budget of a percentage of what the government is spending on all its tribunals, and so it's inalienable funding. And it's composed of, the positions are all defined in terms of their representative interests, and the people who get to appoint them are people like the Chambers of Commerce for those representing business, the union movement for those representing workers, the Law Society for the lawyers, and so on. And probably you put a judge or two in amongst that as well. So you have a council that is demonstrably independent of the government. I'm not the first to recommend a reform. By actual count, there have been, I think, 31 major studies of administrative agencies and tribunals over the decades. Hardly any of the reform recommendations have ever been successful. They all sit on the shelf. It's the biggest shelf in reform history. And the reason for that is that the interests of the government, the interests of the politicians, the interests of the bureaucrats are all collaborate in liking the way it is. They've made it that way and they like it. They like it because, first of all, these tribunals are one of the major sources of the patronage fodder. The other problem is that the government doesn't like the idea of a truly independent tribunal dealing with with these issues. And so they like having the tribunals and the members under their thumb. The bureaucrats also are nervous about an independent tribunal reviewing the decisions that they are making in public and, without any strings attached to them. So all the interests at play, all the people that might be recruited into embracing a reform proposal, all have very strong interests in maintaining the status quo. So it's the theme of my book that no change will ever occur until the Supreme Court of Canada declares that all of this is constitutionally invalid. Well, I'd like to say to the litigants out there that if they look at the back of my book, they'll find a toolkit for litigators while we await the Supreme Court of Canada to make this decision. There's a lot of grounds for thinking that most of the decisions of the tribunals across the province and the country are invalid because they don't comply with rule of law principles, and in that non-compliance probably cannot be justified by unequivocally clear legislation, which, absent constitutional constraints, the legislatures can do what they want. But if they're going to mess around with the rule of law principles, they have to do it with unequivocally clear language. And there's a lot of stuff going on with tribunals that are not justified by that kind of legislative support.
Unjust by Design, Canada's Administrative Justice System. Written by Ron Ellis. Published by UBC Press.